This is Sheriff Reagan's Christmas Boots, a Wyldhaven Christmas novella, written by Lynnette Bonner, narrated by Amy Lilly. Chapter 1. Charlotte tossed and turned fretfully for several hours before she heard the thump of Reagan's boots hitting the bedroom floor and felt the dip of the bed as he climbed in. He'd been dealing with a brawl at McGinty's alehouse, and she'd partly been worried over his safety, but her mind was eased by the knowledge that he had his deputy, Joseph Rodante, and his mother's new husband, Zane Holloway, as backup. But if she were honest, her main concern these past few days was because December was almost upon them, and she didn't yet have a clue what to buy for Reagan's Christmas present. Reagan reached over and squeezed her hand. "Hope I didn't wake you." She shook her head, then realized he couldn't see her in the dark, so said, "No, I've been awake. I'll sleep better now that you're home." Reagan grunted and punched his pillow into a more comfortable position. "If you're going to have a difficult time sleeping every time I'm called out in the night, I'll have to look into making Joe or Zane handle all the late-night calls." Charlotte socked his arm gently. "You wouldn't do that to Leora or your mother, especially not your mother." Reagan yawned loudly, and his voice was more muted when he replied, "Yes, but she's been doing a lot less worrying lately, have you noticed?" "I have indeed." Reagan's response was a soft snore. Charlotte sighed and flipped over on her back to stare into the darkness. She, on the other hand, had been worrying a lot of late. What did one buy for their husband for Christmas? Last year had been fairly easy. It had been their very first Christmas, and so presents had been things they'd needed for their home. Reagan had bought her a new stove for the kitchen, since Old Man Jonas, the previous owner of their house, had likely purchased his before the start of the Civil War. And she'd bought Reagan a newfangled pen that stored ink right in the shaft, and a new shaving bowl and razor. But this year, she'd been racking her brain for months and hadn't been able to come up with an idea. Not because she didn't have ideas, but because, since she'd quit her teaching job to stay at home and be a wife, funds were much tighter this year than they had been last. After a few hours of restless sleep, she woke, heart still weighed down by her predicament. She lay listening to Reagan snoring until the sun pierced past the thin gap in the bedroom's calico curtains. Reagan mumbled and turned over. She threw an arm across her eyes and angled her head away. She needed more sleep, but thoughts of all she had to get done this day refused her the comfort of continued slumber. She eased from beneath the covers, doing her best not to disturb Reagan. She hadn't taken 2 steps before she stubbed her toe on something hard and unyielding. Biting back a yelp and a grumble of irritation, she fumbled through the shadows to feel what it was. Reagan's boots. She gritted her teeth. In his weariness, he'd obviously discarded them without too much thought. She grasped the boots by their tops to carry them to their proper place near the bureau. The shaft of light landed on them as she set them on the floor, and she felt her concern mount. The boots were worn and aged. The leather had definitely seen better days, but of greater concern was the large gap where the top of the shoe had separated from the sole. Reagan had made no complaint, yet the days recently had been bitterly cold. It just wouldn't do for him to keep wearing such shabby shoes, not only because his feet needed to be warm, but also because it simply wasn't a good image for the sheriff to be tromping around in shoes that were barely holding together. It didn't cast Wyldhaven in a good light. She left the boots in their place by the bureau, but smiled. And as she headed for the kitchen to start breakfast, she felt like a burden had been lifted. Finally, she knew what her Christmas present this year ought to be. But her relief over knowing what to buy was mixed with worry over the how of it. They would be cheaper from the Sears and Roebuck catalog, but at this date it was too late to have them shipped. She would just have to order a more expensive pair from Mr. Giddens at the livery. Stepping to the cupboard, she pulled the teacup from the top shelf and dumped all the money onto the counter. $2.06. She was pleased. She hadn't realized that she'd saved up quite that much. It ought to be enough to buy a pair of boots, oughtn't it? But in what size? Reagan only had the one pair of boots, and they were always on his feet unless he was sleeping, so she couldn't take them by the livery for a size comparison. She frowned as she stared at the scrambled eggs she was cooking. Maybe his mother would know. Yes, that was the solution. She gave a little nod. She would swing by her mother-in-law's later to ask her about the size. Reagan woke an hour later and entered the kitchen with his boots in one hand. A large yawn stretched his jaw as he sank into one of the chairs at the table. He scrubbed a hand over his head, displacing his hair in all directions before he bent and tugged on the boots. Charlotte poured a cup of coffee and set it before him. She grinned and scooped her fingers into his hair, combing it into some semblance of order. "Whatever did you do about your unruly locks before I became your wife, dear sheriff?" "I combed it myself, but now I leave it messy to get you close enough to catch." He caught her wrist and tugged her onto his lap, looking up with a smile. He winked and raised his lips to hers. Charlotte relished the feel of his strong hands at her back, the soft hair at the nape of his neck between her fingers, and the brush of his lips over hers. Only a moment later, a knock sounded on the kitchen door. "Sheriff? Sheriff, you up?" Reagan sighed and set her away from him. "Looks like my day is off to a rousing start." He opened the door. Washington Nolan stood on the porch. "Sorry to bother you, sir, but you're needed in town." Reagan grabbed 2 biscuits and pressed some eggs between them. Raising the makeshift sandwich, he said, "See you at dinner." Then he snagged his hat from the peg, stepped onto the porch, and pulled the door closed behind him. Charlotte sighed and served herself a plate, sinking down at the table to eat alone. Again. Chapter 2. Charlotte hurried through her breakfast and the morning's house chores, and then, with her coat tucked close about her neck and her breath fogging the morning, bustled through the cold to feed and water the chickens. She added wood to the banked fire in the old stove that Reagan had repurposed to keep the henhouse warm, and then hurried the mile into town to talk to Jacinda, Reagan's mother. She felt a little nervous about the time frame, but if Jacinda knew the size and she got the order put in today, all should be fine. Jacinda opened her kitchen door, wiping her hands on a towel. "Oh, it's you. Come in. It's colder than Belle's shoulder out here." With a chuckle over the reference to Belle Castaigne's perpetual snootiness, Charlotte scooted into the warmth of the kitchen and hung her wraps on the hooks by the door. Jacinda gave her a guilty look as she set a steaming cup of the herbal tea she kept just for Charlotte onto the table and nudged the sugar bowl her way. "Poor Belle. I really shouldn't have said that. She's gone through a lot in the past few years, and I'll be the first to admit that she's really stepped up to help her mother after William's passing." Charlotte pressed her lips together, not wanting to agree that she shouldn't have spoken like that and condemn her mother-in-law, but also not wanting to reassure her, since it was true that they shouldn't speak at Belle's expense. Instead, she offered, "I think I figured out what I'm going to get for Reagan, finally." Jacinda pulled out a chair and sank down, gesturing for her to do the same. "Do tell." "Boots." Charlotte stirred a teaspoon of sugar into her teacup. "Good luck getting him to give up his comfortable pair." Jacinda grinned over the rim of her cup. Charlotte tilted her head. "Am I going to have to make those old raggedy ones disappear?" "Most likely." "Well, the side of one busted out just the other day, so hopefully I won't have to fight him too passionately. But I came by for a reason. I don't know what size to have Mr. Giddens make." Jacinda's eyes widened. "Oh, dear. I always just took a tracing of his feet to Bill. I never asked what size it corresponded to." Willing away her disappointment, Charlotte set down her cup. "I see. Well, maybe Mr. Giddens will remember the right size. I'll pop over to the livery and ask him. What are you getting for Zane?" Since Jacinda and her U.S. Marshal husband had only been married for a few months, this would be their first Christmas together. With a swipe at some invisible specks on the table, Jacinda grinned and gave a pump of her brows. "Zane's old Morgan isn't as spry as he used to be, so I placed an order for an Appaloosa from the ranch we visited on our wedding tour. He admired both the dam and the sire, so I know he's going to be thrilled." "That's so exciting. How are you getting it here?" It's scheduled to arrive on the train in a few weeks. She waved a hand. I just hope everything goes smoothly. Deputy Joe has agreed to keep it in his and Leora's barn until Christmas morning. Charlotte reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Well, I can't wait to see it. For now, I'd better get going. I want to get my order in with plenty of time for Mr. Giddens to get them made. She stood and gestured to the cups. Can I help you wash these? Jacinda brushed away the offer. No, it won't take me but a moment. Thanks for stopping by. Thank you for the tea. Charlotte wrapped her scarf around her throat and slipped into her coat before giving Jacinda a hug. Have a good day. I'll let you know what I find out. With that, she dashed out into the fat flakes that were now falling from the sky. Thankfully, Jacinda's house was on the same end of town as the livery. Bill Giddens sat hunched near the pot-bellied stove in the livery tack room, cleaning a harness. Charlotte got right down to business. Hi, Bill. I need you to keep a Christmas secret. Bill set the harness aside and scratched at his long gray whiskers. Beg pardon, ma'am? Charlotte smiled. I want to buy the sheriff a pair of boots. Bill's face lit up. Oh, yes'm. That there I can do. I have all the fixins just here. He flipped a canvas cover off the table in the corner. On the table, several pairs of boots were lined up. Charlotte's gaze immediately settled on the pair on the end. Made of a rich brown leather, they had been hand-tooled and decorated with intricate stitching. Oh my, these are beautiful. She picked one up. The leather was as fine and soft as it looked, yet felt sturdy enough to last for a good long while. Would you be able to have a pair of these made by Christmas? Oh, yes, ma'am, I can get right to it. That pair there, they would be $7. Charlotte dropped the boot as though it had just bitten her. $7. Her heart fell. She thought of the $2.06 in her savings cup. Could she come up with $4.02 before Christmas? She couldn't think how she would be able to do so. I didn't realize they would come so dear. A lot of work goes into that pair, ma'am. Oh, I'm sure it does. I didn't mean to imply they weren't worth the cost. Bill nodded. He pointed to a pair in the middle. That pair there would only run you $5. Charlotte twisted her lips as she studied the pair he'd indicated. They were fine. They just didn't have all the nice details the other pair had. She wanted Reagan to have the best. Her thoughts again flitted to the contents of the teacup on her top shelf, and she sighed. Her mother had always said she had champagne taste. The problem was, now that she was no longer teaching, she only had a beer budget. So not only did she not know Reagan's boot size, but she didn't even have the funds for the ugliest pair of boots on the table. Her shoulders sagged. At the reminder of the other fly in her ointment, she turned to Bill. Do you happen to know the size of the sheriff's boots? Bill scratched his whiskered chin. No, ma'am, can't rightly say as I do. Been some time since Reagan ordered hisself a pair. But if you bring me a sketch of his foot, I can make that do just fine. Charlotte picked up the boot once more and smoothed her thumb across some of the stitches. How long will it take you to make a pair? Depends on which pair you want. That fancy pair, I need at least 4 weeks to make those. These others can be done in 3. Charlotte's heart fell a few more degrees. She set the boot down once more. I see. Well, I hope to order a pair. I have to... Her face flamed at the thought of admitting that she might not have enough money. Never in her life had she had that issue. Papa had always snapped his fingers and given her anything she wanted. But she and Reagan were determined to make a go of things on their own. They'd both determined that they would never ask a loan from anyone. Your pardon, ma'am? Charlotte came to and realized she'd left Bill hanging in the middle of her sentence. I'll let you know by Monday if I plan to place the order. Will that give you enough time to get the fancy pair made by Christmas? He calculated on his fingers and then nodded. Just enough time, ma'am. Good. Then I'll let you know. Yes'm. Bill hunched onto his stool and took up his harness once more. Charlotte bade him farewell and tucked her coat close around her throat as she stepped out into the bracing winter wind and snow. She pressed her lips together in discouragement. Today was Thursday. She had 4 more days to come up with the money and a plan. Even if she could figure out how to raise the money, how was she to get a tracing of Reagan's foot without raising his suspicions? She sighed and headed toward Dixie's boarding house. Maybe Dixie could help her figure this out. At any rate, she could use another cup of something hot to warm her up before she walked home. Chapter 3. Dixie's dining room smelled like blueberry pancakes and bacon. Despite the fact that she'd eaten a hearty breakfast, Charlotte's mouth started watering the moment she stepped through the doors. Dixie glanced up from where she stood refilling a customer's mug. "Oh, hi. I'm so glad you stopped by. I could really stand to put my feet up for a few minutes." She rested one hand on her perfectly rounded belly, then swung her head toward the kitchen in a follow-me motion. Charlotte smiled and trailed behind Dixie's ever-so-slightly duck-like waddle. Dixie and the doctor's first baby was due any day now. Charlotte knew that Doc had been trying to get Dixie to take things a bit easier. He'd even hired both Susan and Belle Castaigne to work full-time in the kitchen after Susan's husband, William, had passed away last March. But Dixie still insisted on overseeing the breakfast cooking. Dixie pushed through the batwing doors into the kitchen. Steam rose in misty drifts from the double sink beneath the back window. Belle, whose hands were buried in the hot water up to her elbows, tossed a glance over her shoulder. She acknowledged Charlotte with a dip of her chin before returning to washing dishes. Susan offered a smile from where she stood drying the plates Belle placed into the rack. "Morning, Charlotte." "Good morning." Charlotte gave both women a quick squeeze. Then she sank down at the little kitchen table across from Dixie, who had dropped into a chair and promptly propped her feet on a nearby stool. "Pardon my unladylike sprawl," she smiled. Charlotte tugged off her gloves as she returned the smile. "I'm sure it must feel like a bit of heaven to put your feet up. How is the little one behaving today?" Dixie rubbed her belly in a circular motion and loosed a sigh. "I'm not sure if it's elbows or knees, but someone has been gouging me in the ribs all morning." Charlotte chuckled and set her gloves on the table. "Only a few weeks and you'll be able to tickle little toes in retaliation." Dixie laughed. "I do deserve at least a poke or two." Motioning to the coffee pot Dixie had placed on the stove, Charlotte lifted her brows. "Can I pour you a cup?" Dixie waved a hand. "Of course, and help yourself to the hot water. That blueberry tea you like is there on the shelf. In fact, I should avoid more coffee. I'll take some tea, too." She glanced toward the sink. "Susan? Belle? Would you like to join us?" Susan stepped over and set the sugar bowl and a pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't mind if I do, but I'm having coffee." She grinned. "I'll just finish washing this last stack of plates." Belle's words weren't unfriendly, just all business. Charlotte poured Susan a cup of coffee and fixed 2 cups of the herbal tea, then settled into her seat. She scooped a little sugar into her tea and relished a sip of the tart blueberry concoction. She appreciated the fact that Dixie kept the drink just for her. Both coffee and tea gave her debilitating headaches. Chocolate, too. "So, catch me up on all the news from town. Since I quit teaching, I feel like I miss out. By the time I hear about something, it's already days-old news." Susan nodded. "You know Zoe's been helping to tutor the children after school each day." "Yes, I'd heard that." Dixie's lips thinned a little. "From what I've heard, she's been doing quite a bit of the teaching, too." Susan opened her mouth as if to reply, but then snapped it shut. She deliberately lifted her cup and blew on the black brew. But then she plunked the cup down. "Oh, I can't stand to keep it to myself any longer. Zoe has decided to take the teaching exam. I'm so proud of her." A thrill of joy bubbled up inside of Charlotte. "She has? Oh, that's such great news. I always felt she would be a wonderful teacher." A plate crashed to the floor. Shards shot in all directions. Belle gasped. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Griffin. I can't think how that happened." Susan leapt to her feet and hurried to fetch the broom in the corner. Charlotte took in Belle's stricken face. Are you injured, Belle? The girl seemed to give herself a little shake. No, I'm fine. She raised her gaze to Dixie. I'm so sorry. I'll cover the cost from my next pay. Dixie hadn't even moved. Please, Belle. She waved a hand. Accidents happen. I'm just glad you are unharmed. I'm not about to charge you for replacing a plate that was probably already chipped to start with. Belle bent to pick up the larger pieces, while her mother set to sweeping up the smaller bits. An uneasy silence settled. Charlotte wanted to remove the scrutiny from Belle. So, the teacher's exam. When does Zoe take it? Susan moved to the garbage bucket in the corner. She goes to Seattle mid-December. I'll accompany her. You're making the trek to Seattle this time of year? Susan gave a nod. The weather has been fairly mild this winter. We'll push hard so we aren't out in it for too many days. And Washington Nolan will escort us. Thankfully, he has time to make the trip before he leaves to join the cavalry. Wait, what? I hadn't heard that. He's joining the cavalry? Dixie sipped from her cup and gave a happy sigh. He leaves just after the new year. He's to be stationed with the 7th Cavalry Regiment in New Mexico. Oh, my. Well, I'll certainly add him to my prayer list. With the cleanup of the broken plate complete, both Belle and Susan sank down at the table. Belle smirked. I guess the rest of those plates will have to wait. I obviously need a coffee break. Everyone chuckled, and Charlotte quickly fetched the pot and poured another cup for Belle. As she sank back into her seat, Dixie peered at Charlotte over the top of her mug. So, what brings you by? Charlotte pulled a face. I can't just swing by for a chat. You know you can, any time, but I've never known you to do anything out of your routine unless you were on a mission of some sort. I'm that predictable? Dixie arched a brow. Well? Charlotte chuckled. Fine, I'm that predictable. I've decided to buy Reagan a pair of boots for Christmas, only I don't know his boot size, nor do I have nearly enough money. The other 3 women looked at each other. Belle broke the silence. Well, how are you going to buy them if you don't have the money? Charlotte sighed. That's why I'm here. I need help figuring that out. Susan arched a brow. And his boot size? Charlotte slumped back into her seat. I need help with that, too. The ladies chuckled. Chapter 4. Fixing Dixie with a look, Charlotte arched a brow. Do you know what you are getting Flynn? A mysterious smile touched Dixie's lips. I do. She leaned in. Tell me. Setting her cup back in her saucer, Dixie clasped her hands. Let's just say that the shopping trip I'm taking to Seattle in a couple of weeks isn't for new dresses, as Flynn thinks. She grinned. I've purchased him a sleigh from the premier sleigh maker in this region. He's gonna love it. It will certainly make his trips out to the camps more comfortable. Oh, that sounds lovely. But Flynn is letting you travel to Seattle so soon before the baby is due to come? Charlotte's brow furrowed. Taking another sip of tea, Dixie brushed the concern aside. Flynn says all is progressing normally and I'll be taking the train. So only a day there, 1 day in town, and then another day back. Everything will be fine. Charlotte blew out a breath. Well, I'm glad you have everything figured out. Now, any ideas for how I should... A knock sounded at the back door. Dixie made to stand, but Susan rose quickly and waved her back into her seat. I'll get it. Ken Davis stood outside the door, hat in one hand and a fishing creel in the other. Snow dusted his shoulders and hat, and he hunched his coat up around his ears. Susan stepped back, inviting him in with a smile. Once he was inside and the door shut, she peered into his creel. Well, now, look here. Fresh fish for tonight's dinner. The loggers will be so pleased. Wait right here and I'll get your payment. She bustled into the pantry, where Dixie kept her money for such purchases. Ken fidgeted a bit when he noticed the other 3 women seated at the table looking at him. Ladies? He gave a little bow that was more nod than anything. Dixie smiled at him. Thank you so much, Ken. I always appreciate the addition of your fresh catches to my menu. I'm sure it was cold work, sitting still long enough to catch those. He twisted his hat through his fingers, expression serious as usual. You pay me well, Mrs. Griffin. I'm always happy to sell to you. Dixie suddenly got a light in her eyes. She glanced back and forth between Charlotte and Ken. Ken, you're an enterprising soul. Mrs. Callahan here was just sharing that she needs to make some Christmas money. What would you advise? Ken didn't even hesitate. His eyes softened just a touch as he said, After the last community gathering, I heard several men raving about your apple pie, Mrs. Callahan. He dipped a nod, sampled a piece myself, and it was mighty tasty. His gaze pinged to Dixie. Been a while since Mrs. Griffin offered desserts because of, His cheeks blazed, and he kicked at the floorboards with one toe. Well, anyhow, I'm thinking that if Mrs. Griffin isn't opposed to the idea, that you could bake pies and sell them by the slice right here in the diner. He shrugged, as if it was the simplest solution in the world. Mrs. Griffin can likely even make a bit of profit for herself. Charlotte blinked at Dixie, who blinked back. Dixie was the first to break the silence. That's a fabulous idea. Charlotte grinned. Why didn't I think of that? I've still got plenty of apples in the cellar, and I've enough money to buy the flour and sugar. It's the butter I'm not sure of. Mr. Hines does ask a dear price for it. We were buying our milk from Mr. King and making our own butter, but his cow has gone dry. Belle cleared her throat. Our cow is still giving a goodly amount of milk, and I'm sure Ma would be happy to sell you enough cream to make the butter you'll need. Of course we will. Susan nodded as she handed Ken his payment for the fish. And I can spare you a bucket of milk every other week after that, too. What do you say to 50 cents for the month? Well, that sounds like a very good price. Charlotte eased back in her chair. Oh, this is such a load off my mind. Now all I have to figure out is how to finagle his boot size out of him without raising his suspicions. Dixie chuckled. And bake pies every day without him wondering why the house smells so delicious, yet he hasn't had a bit of dessert for weeks. Charlotte laughed. Oh, that's true. I'll have to bake them first thing in the mornings after he leaves, so the smell won't still be lingering when he gets home. If you don't mind my input on his shoe size, Mrs. Callahan, I might have an idea for you there, too. Ken peered at her as he tucked his money away in his poke. I'm all ears. He shoved the drawstring bag into the inside pocket of his coat. Heard Zoe talking to Wash about how she's having the kids down to the school do a project where they all line their feet up by size around the classroom. Line their feet up? Charlotte couldn't figure out what he could mean. Yes'm, tracings. They trace 'em, then cut 'em out and put 'em around the room by size. Oh. She still felt confused. She glanced at Dixie, who didn't seem to understand any better than she did. How does that help me? Ken clasped his hands behind his back, and Charlotte had a feeling that if his face were more expressive, it would be showing a great deal of impatience with her density. But his tone was the epitome of patience when he spoke. Zoe could ask the sheriff for a tracing of his feet to add to the wall. Oh, that's brilliant. While she's at it, she maybe ought to ask a few other merchants so he doesn't get suspicious, and, well, maybe. He gestured at Dixie, and his face turned red again. Doc and Mrs. Griffin would like to have their baby's feet traced soon as it arrives. Dixie rested one hand on her rounded belly. Oh, Ken, that's an amazing idea. We can put it away in a keepsake box when Zoe takes him down. He nodded. Yes'm. Charlotte couldn't help herself. She rushed across the room and threw her arms around Ken's neck. He stiffened, but she didn't let that stop her. She dropped a kiss on his cheek. You're the best, Ken Davis. A thought hit her then. She pulled back and looked at him. Where are you and Parson Clay going for Christmas? You are welcome to join Reagan and me. He stepped back and waved his hat in a dismissive gesture. Oh, no, ma'am. The parson has plans to visit his family back east. Don't worry any about us. Charlotte squeezed his arm. Well, I'm sure that will be an adventure. I'm glad you have someplace to go. And thank you again. My pleasure. He offered a nod of farewell and then stepped out into the frosty morning. Charlotte sank back down at the table. My, that's a relief off my mind. Pure providence that Kin stopped by, I say. Dixie nodded. Agreed. I wonder how he and the parson will get along on a trip over Christmas. They've seemed a bit at odds with each other the past several weeks. I'm glad they have a place to go. Yes, I'm thankful too. That boy could certainly use some joy in his life. Dixie adjusted the position of her feet on the stool. Indeed. So, remind me how much you charge for a slice of pie. 5 cents. 8 slices per pie? Dixie nodded. And what would my cut of that be? Dixie tilted her head. How about this? I haven't been selling any pies at all, and just having them back on the menu will make my customers so happy. So how about for the first 2 weeks you keep all of it? Then after that, we can see if you want to keep making them and discuss it further. Charlotte did some quick calculations, and after deducting her costs for the cream, sugar, and flour, 2 weeks should give her just enough money to pay for the boots. She squeezed Dixie's hand. You're a gem. Dixie only smiled and sipped her tea, but after a moment she squirmed uncomfortably and adjusted her feet again. Susan immediately stood. You should go upstairs and rest. Belle and I will take care of the remainder of today's meals. Dixie winced as she lumbered to her feet and rubbed her belly. You know, I don't mind if I do. I'm suddenly feeling as though I could sleep for a week. Charlotte took her cue and stood too. And I'd best go talk to Zoe and put the plan into motion. She gave first Dixie and then Belle and Susan quick hugs. Susan stepped back. We'll bring you plenty of cream and a bucket of milk tomorrow. Thank you. I'll swing by here to pick it up first thing. With that, she hurried out and crossed the street toward the schoolhouse. Chapter 5. Kin settled his hat on his head and tugged his collar up around his ears as he stepped onto the street. If there was a God in heaven, he hoped the Almighty would forgive him for lying about having a place to spend Christmas. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate Mrs. Callahan's offer. It was just that Christmas time was about family, and no one really wanted Wyldhaven's rogue orphan to spend Christmas with them, no matter how kindly stated their offers. Parson Clay had, of course, invited him to return east with him to visit his family, but Kin could only surmise that the invitation had come out of duty. And besides, a week spent with the parson in the stuffy confines of a train car would mean a week of hearing stories about how God had given the man so much joy once he quit fighting for his own way. Kin was bone-weary of that, and it was especially not something he wanted to subject himself to on Christmas. Not only that, but the parson was taking Tommy Crispin with him on the trip, and Kin could sure use a break from the simpleton's incessant questions and chatter. When Wash had learned he wasn't taking the train with the parson, he had invited him too, but Kin had also put him off. Wash's family barely had enough money for presents of their own, much less for an extra, and they would feel obligated to get him something if he were to spend Christmas with them. It was only one day. He would drink plenty to forget, spend the morning sleeping in, and let everyone else enjoy their families. Then the day would be done, and he wouldn't have to think about it again for a whole year, and no one would be the wiser. They'd all think he was at someone else's place. Besides, he'd been thinking more and more about moving to Seattle to find more permanent work. Maybe he'd even see about becoming an apprentice in a law office. He'd read a few books about the law and wouldn't mind learning a little more about how the justice system worked. McGinty stepped into the doorway of his saloon, drawing a beer mug. He gave Kin a wave and lifted the mug with a little waggle. Kin swallowed. A drink would be mighty satisfying right about now. But he'd promised Wash he'd try to cut back, and he'd been doing pretty good for the past few days. He rubbed his hand over the bulge of his money sack in his jacket. Even had a little bit saved up since he'd quit spending it all at McGinty's. But he licked his lips. McGinty smiled at him. Kin took a step. Movement down the street caught his attention. It was just the flicker of a white hat by the jailhouse alley. He watched. A moment later, Sheriff Reagan poked his head out and scanned the street in both directions, then waved frantically for Kin to join him and withdrew again. Kin's brow furrowed. He waved off McGinty as he headed toward the alley. McGinty frowned and looked out in the direction of the alley, but when he didn't see anything, withdrew with a gesture of disgust. Kin didn't let it get to him. He was too curious about what the sheriff could want. The sheriff was normally a very level-headed man, and he couldn't figure out what might have the man acting so crazy. When he stepped into the alley, the sheriff was pacing back and forth. Near his feet were 2 bushel baskets filled with apples. Kin's heart gave a thump of dread. He looked up and met the man's gaze. Sheriff Reagan gestured in the direction of the dining room. "I saw Charlotte go into the Boardinghouse earlier, and then you go in after. Do you think she'll be busy with Dixie for a while? I've been trying to figure out how to get her out of the house so I could sell these apples to Mr. Hines. Money's been a bit tight this Christmas, and he's offered me a good price, but I don't want Charlotte to catch me hauling 'em across the street." Kin swallowed. He stared down at the apples for a moment. He felt a bit like he'd just walked onto the stage in the middle of a theatrical drama, and it was his job to instigate the resolution. He cleared his throat, rubbed his jaw. The sheriff frowned at him. "Was Charlotte in the Boardinghouse kitchen just now?" "Yes." "Are these your apples?" More precisely, Mrs. Callahan's apples, the ones she planned to use to make pies so she could buy the sheriff a pair of boots. The sheriff leaned a little closer and sniffed. "You been drinking again, kid?" "No, sir." The sheriff plunked his hands on his hips. "Of course these are my apples. I wouldn't be trying to sell 'em if they weren't." Kin worked his tongue over his lips. "What I mean to ask is, are these all the apples you have?" The sheriff waved a hand. "Yes, but don't worry. This'll be more than enough to buy her the bolt of lace she's been eyeing. So, do you think she'll be busy for a while?" Heart falling, Kin glanced back toward the street. How did he fix this? The sheriff stepped closer. "You are acting mighty strange. Is everything all right?" "Yes, fine. I was just—" "I'll buy the apples from you. What price did Mr. Hines offer?" The sheriff frowned. "He's offered me $4 per basket." Kin swallowed. $8. And he'd have to beat Mr. Hines's price to boot. But he didn't really have much he needed money for. And he could hear the tinny piano in McGinty's plunking out Clapham Town End. It would likely save him from drinking the money away anyhow. Besides his friendship with Wash, Mrs. Callahan had been one of the first bright spots in his entire life. She'd always encouraged him to do better, but never with the condescension that some had directed his way. And the sheriff was a kind man, even if he did enforce the law with exacting measure. Kin dipped his chin, decision made. "I'll pay you $4.50 per bushel." The sheriff blinked at him. "Why do you need this many apples?" Kin shrugged. "It's Christmas." He grinned, hoping the sheriff would let the matter drop with that. He felt a sudden joy in what he was about to do. The sheriff scratched his jaw. "Well, I guess I didn't promise Jerry I'd do it. We only discussed what his price would be, and I said I'd think on it." He stretched out a hand. "So, you have yourself a deal." Kin shook his hand and paid him, then watched as the sheriff, newfound cash in hand, carefully glanced both ways before dashing across the street to the mercantile. Kin transferred his attention to the 2 bushels of apples stacked at his feet. He gave a little shake of his head, hefted them, and hurried toward the Callahan place. He needed to get these back into the Callahan cellar before Mrs. Callahan got back to her place. Chapter 6. "Yes, Miss Castaigne," the children chorused, as Charlotte stepped through the back door of the church, which functioned as Wyldhaven's schoolhouse during the week. Surprised to hear the children addressing Zoe, Charlotte poked her head around the partition that separated the classroom from the back doors as she tugged off her gloves. Zoe stood at the blackboard, instructing the children in long division. Charlotte frowned. She searched the room but didn't see Mr. Havisham, the town's teacher. Where was he? Noticing her, Zoe hesitated, which drew the attention of all the children to the back of the room. "Mrs. Callahan!" Several of the older ones leapt to their feet and rushed to envelop her with boisterous hugs. Even though it had been months now since she'd last been their teacher, it felt good to know that some of them still remembered her with fondness. Charlotte chuckled and cuddled each of them for a moment, but then urged them all back to their seats. She met Zoe's gaze. "Where's Mr. Havisham?" Swiping at chalk dust on her fingers, Zoe couldn't seem to meet her gaze. Mr. Havisham rarely makes an appearance before morning break." Grant, the youngest Nolan brother, piped up from the back of the classroom, where his long legs were crammed beneath a too-small-for-him desk. He gave a definitive nod. Miss Castaigne does most of the teaching." Charlotte felt her heart begin to thump against her breastbone. The town council wasn't paying the man to lay home a bed while someone else did his work for him. Zoe lifted a hand to ward off further questions. "It's not as bad as it might first seem. What brings you by today?" Zoe gave a pointed look toward all the children sitting enraptured at their desks. Charlotte let her gaze drift over the students. She supposed Zoe was correct that this wasn't the time or place to have a discussion about Mr. Havisham's downfalls. "When you have a moment, may I speak to you outside?" "Certainly." Zoe nodded. "Class, copy down your work and then focus quietly on your problems. I'll be back in just a moment." She tipped a nod toward the door. Pulse pounding faster than ever in her ears, Charlotte went out and waited for her on the small landing. The moment Zoe made her appearance, Charlotte stepped toward her. "How long has he had you teaching for him?" Zoe sighed. She folded her hands and seemed to contemplate her answer. "I don't want to get him into trouble." Charlotte's lips pinched. "You won't be getting him into trouble. You'll only be telling me the truth." With the toe of one boot, Zoe scuffed at the porch boards. "Since the beginning of the school year, I have been teaching all the morning classes." Charlotte's teeth slammed together. "And?" "He arrives at break time, checks to make sure all is going well, and then goes over to McGinty's till lunch." "And Ewan hasn't said anything to anyone?" Still studying the boards at her feet, Zoe mumbled, "I asked him not to mention it. Just like I'll ask you not to mention it to anyone. I enjoy being able to help the kids and don't want to lose that." "Oh, you won't lose it. I'll see to that. But I'll not stand by and let you do all the work and him collect all the money, and that's certain." Zoe's eyes widened a little. She held her silence. Charlotte realized that she'd let her frustration boil over into her tone. She took a calming breath. "Sorry. It just makes me madder than a hungry bear fresh out of hibernation to learn he's been using you so." "I wouldn't call it using." Zoe kicked at a knot in one of the boards. "Well, it is. And as soon as you have your teaching certificate, I intend to let the board know I think you should have the job you've been doing all these months anyhow." Zoe's eyes brightened. "You could do that?" "Oh, that would be such a relief to Ma and the family." "I can, and I will. I was so excited to hear that you were taking the teacher's exam." "I've been studying like crazy." Zoe pulled a face. "But I'm still so nervous." With a wave of her hand, Charlotte dashed away the concern. "As smart as you are, I know you'll have no problem passing the test." Zoe rubbed her hands together. "I hope so. Is that what brought you by today?" Charlotte chuckled. "I heard that you're doing a project where you trace everyone's feet." Zoe's frown said she couldn't figure out why that would have brought Charlotte by. "Yes." Charlotte explained her dilemma and Kin's idea for the solution. Zoe chuckled. "Oh, that's brilliant. Yes, I can ask the sheriff to get his feet measured. In fact, I should ask all the Wyldhaven citizens, and maybe we can have everyone into the classroom to view the display and combine it with a Christmas party fundraiser for some larger desks for the bigger boys. Though it does give me a chuckle to see Lincoln and Grant sitting there with their knees up by their ears." She winked. "That's a fabulous idea. I'm sure you could use some funds to buy more books, too." "Oh, that's certain." Zoe grimaced. David Hines came to school the other day, and his arithmetic primer was torn completely in half and missing several pages. He said he'd accidentally dripped some butter on it and then had to rescue it from his dog. Charlotte chuckled and squeezed Zoe's arm. "It reminds me of Jinx." Zoe nodded and rolled her eyes. "For a taste of butter, Jinx would eat Satan's socks. Anyhow, I'll go right down to the sheriff's office as soon as school's out for the day and get that measurement for you." Charlotte thanked Zoe for her help and left with the promise to check back the next day to retrieve the drawing. Chapter 7. Charlotte was still chuckling as she made her way toward home. But the longer she walked, and the more she thought about what Mr. Havisham was doing, the angrier she became until her dander was all a ruffle. By the time she reached the base of the hill, beyond which lay her house, outrage pumped through her. She hefted a double handful of skirts and stomped toward home. Of all the sneaking things to do! Well, as soon as Zoe had her teaching certificate, the school board would be hearing from Charlotte on the need for his replacement. For now, Charlotte's immediate problem was taken care of. And maybe it was Providence that had sent her to Zoe for part of her solution so that she could learn just exactly what Mr. Havisham was up to. Charlotte crested the hill and paused to lean against a tree and catch her breath. She'd taken that steep road much too quickly. Hand propped against a trunk, she looked down on the little cabin she and Reagan had purchased from Mr. Jonas's son just after the old man had passed on. Smoke rose in a thin wisp from the chimney due to the banked fire she had left in the stove, and with the mountains beyond, it created a picturesque scene. The barn could be in better shape, but they had worked on one end of it to make it warm and snug for Reagan's horse. Next year, when they had enough money, they would finish the rest of it. Movement caught her eye, and she stiffened. Who was that coming up out of the cellar behind the cabin? She leaned in and squinted. It was a man. He dropped the heavy, sodded lid back into place, dusted his hands, and looked around. Charlotte gasped and stepped to the side of the path behind a tree before he could see her. What had Ken Davis been doing in their cellar? She peered around the tree. Ken jogged across the field behind their place. He disappeared into the trees beyond. Heart heavy, Charlotte took the road down to the house. With a sigh, she realized that it was probably best she'd just go to the cellar and see what he might have taken. Of all the shenanigans Ken had pulled in his day, she never would have pegged him to steal from her, or Reagan for that matter. And she'd just watched Susan pay him a goodly sum for the fish he brought to Dixie's diner. He shouldn't be bad enough off that he needed to steal food. Charlotte hauled up the door to the cellar and descended, lighting the lamp at the bottom of the steps. She shone the light into every corner, but nothing seemed to be amiss. She frowned. Not one jar was out of place. There were still 6 eggs in the basket of straw, just as there had been this morning. The 2 bushels of apples were still in the back corner. So what had Ken been doing down here? She returned to the house, but her heart was heavy all day, for she knew that she needed to tell Reagan what she had seen. No matter that he hadn't taken anything, he'd been trespassing, uninvited. She had a simple meal of beef stew and biscuits ready when Reagan walked in the door that evening. He hung his hat and coat on the pegs by the door and then stepped to the sink to pump water for washing. He gave her a nod and a smile. "Evening. Sorry I'm a little late. Zoe came by right as I was leaving with a harebrained idea for a last-minute Christmas fundraiser." "Did she get the tracing of your feet?" Reagan stilled and studied her. "How did you know about that?" Charlotte's mouth went dry. Oh, idiotic, Charlotte. She scrambled for an explanation with a wave of her hand. "I went to town earlier and stopped by the schoolhouse to chat with her for a bit. She mentioned it." Reagan reached for the towel and set to drying his hands. "I see." Charlotte spun away from him, blowing at a strand of hair in relief. She was such a terrible secret keeper. Reagan was quiet as he hung the towel back on its hook, and Charlotte pulled the biscuits from the warming oven. They said a quick prayer, and then settled into silence as they ate. After a moment, Reagan lifted his gaze to hers. "You aren't normally this quiet. Is everything okay?" She sighed, heart pinching. She really hated to tattle on Kin when he seemed to have done nothing wrong. Yet, he also had no business being in their cellar. "Charlie?" Reagan frowned at her. Charlotte waved a hand. "It'll keep. Let's eat while the food is hot. What did Washington Nolan want so early this morning?" Reagan spread butter on a biscuit. "Seems some bandits broke into his pa's barn and stole buckets full of milk. The cow was nearly dry come morning, and the buckets were missing." "Someone stole milk? How crazy! Do you have any leads?" Charlotte's mind flashed to the image of Kin coming out of the cellar. Could he have had something to do with it? But at the Nolan place? Oh, surely not. He and Wash had been the best of friends since they were both in short pants. And yet, she'd thought Kin respected her and Reagan enough that he would never do anything like that to them. Yet there he had been coming out of the cellar. She sipped her broth, reminding herself that she hadn't been able to find anything out of place. She tried to convince herself that there could be a perfectly innocent explanation for his trespass, yet logic seemed to defy that option. She came to and realized that Reagan had been speaking, and she'd missed most of what he said. After that, she tried to keep up her end of the conversation, but as soon as he had finished his last bite of stew, Reagan pushed his bowl away and tossed his serviette down on the table. "Come on, Charlie. Something is wrong. You've not been yourself all evening." Charlotte curled her hands around her mug of hot apple cider and released a breath. She supposed the time had come. "I went into town this morning, as I already mentioned, and when I came back, I saw someone coming out of the cellar." "What?" Reagan stood and reached for his hat, obviously intent on going out to check on it immediately. "You needn't bother going out. I've already been down to look, and nothing is amiss. But—" She hesitated. Did she tell him she knew it was Kin? What would happen to the boy? She clenched her teeth. In truth, Kin Davis was no longer a boy, but a full-grown man, one who should know better than to go skulking through others' cellars. "But what?" Reagan urged. Charlotte gave in. "I saw who it was." Reagan searched her face, brows arching. "It was Kin Davis." Reagan's expression changed subtly. He returned his hat to the peg and then sank back down at the table, fingers drumming. He frowned at Charlotte. "Nothing was missing?" She shook her head. "Not a thing." Reagan rubbed one hand across his jaw. "Maybe he took a few things that you didn't notice? Like apples?" He lifted his coffee cup to his lips. Charlotte shook her head. "No, I was just down there this morning before heading into town. Everything is exactly as I left it. The 2 bushels of apples are stacked right in the corner where they were this morning." Reagan sputtered coffee and quickly swiped at it, snatching up his serviette to wipe his mouth. Charlotte frowned at him. He must have inhaled wrong trying to talk and drink hot liquids at the same time. "You all right?" He nodded, batted away her concern. She let it go. "Anyhow, like I said, nothing seemed disturbed. I have no idea what he was doing down there." "Well, I'll swing by and talk to him about it first thing in the morning. For now, let me help you with these dishes." He rose and took his plate and utensils and the biscuit plate, leaving Charlotte to follow in his wake to the kitchen. She frowned as she gathered up the rest of the items. She tossed a glance toward where he was already pumping water into the sink. It was almost like he didn't want to talk about it anymore. But why would that be? Chapter 8. The banging on the parsonage door the next morning sent a nail straight through Kin's temple. He groaned and rolled over, tugging his pillow over his head. Oh, blast, but his skull felt like a blacksmith had taken a hammer to it in the night, maybe melted it down and tempered it a few times, too. He shouldn't have given Ewan that last $1 for that bottle of rot gut. Had the parson heard him come through his window in the night? Whoever was at the door banged again. "Coming," Coming! The parson's voice drifted through his door. Ken pried one eyelid open and frowned. Tommy sat on his bed across the room, palms pressed together and tucked between his knees as he rocked forward and back. He stared at Ken. You broke the chair." The chair that he used to make late-night entry easier lay in several pieces beneath his window. Ken sighed. Tommy was right. He must have broken it somehow when he came in last night. Parson is mad." Tommy's rocking increased, which meant the parson had definitely heard him come home. The front door creaked, and low voices rumbled. "Ken," the parson's voice was none too gentle, "Law is here to see you." Ken fought to think through the blackness that claimed all the memories of the night before. Had he done something stupid? Well, more stupid than drinking Ewan's homebrew? Tommy rubbed his head, a sure sign that his agitation was on the rise. "Tommy will stay here." "Comin'." He rolled to a sitting position and gripped the edge of the bed to steady himself. Spikes of pain made flashes of light cross his vision. He scrunched his eyes shut. Bang! Ken flinched, seeing Tommy do the same across the room. Bang! Bang! The parson's fist was like to bend the hinges. "Wake up, son. Sheriff Callahan is here." Tommy crawled farther onto his bed and curled his knees to his chest and his arms about his head. "Coming!" Saying the word aloud made him realize that he might have only thought it the first time. He fumbled his arms into his shirt sleeves and tugged on his pants and boots. Before he left the room, he paused to look at Tommy. "PC would never hurt you, Tommy. Not like those others before. Besides," Ken crooked him a smile, "I'm the one he's mad at." Tommy nodded vigorously. "Yep, he mad at you. Mad at you. Tommy, stay here." Ken reached for the doorknob. "That's 'cause you're smarter than me, Tom. A lot smarter." Tommy cackled as he stepped from the room. The parson and the sheriff were sipping coffee and speaking in low tones at the table when he approached, still working on his sleeve buttons. Both men gave him a once-over. "Mornin'." He squinted against the light coming through the window and turned for the coffee pot at the back of the stove. If he was going to jail, he might as well go with a mouthful of the parson's good coffee in his gullet, because he'd tasted the sheriff's and his was downright awful. He sank down at the table and propped his head against one hand. "Whatever I did, Sheriff, just come out and say it, because I got no memory of last night's doings." Parson Clay's jaw bulged, and he folded his arms, but at least he held his silence. The sheriff scrubbed one hand over his cheek. "I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here to ask you why you bought my apples and then put them back in my cellar." "Oh, how did you find out?" "My wife saw you coming out of the cellar, but she reported that everything in the cellar was just as she'd left it, including the 2 bushel baskets of apples." "Oh." Ken's heart fell. So did Mrs. Callahan think him a thief now? The thought was intolerable, yet he couldn't go to her with an explanation without revealing that the sheriff had been about to sell the apples to buy her present. Just like he couldn't tell the sheriff that his wife was making apple pies to sell so she could buy him boots. "Well?" the sheriff urged. Ken stalled by taking a large gulp of coffee. He fought through the muddy sludge of his memories from the day before, searching for some plausible reason for his returning the apples. His thoughts stumbled onto the reminder of Mrs. Callahan throwing her arms around his neck, giving him a kiss, and then inviting him to Christmas. That could work. It was thin, but it was all he had. Both the sheriff and PC stared at him, waiting for a response. He swallowed another gulp of scalding coffee. "It's just, well, you see, the parson is going back east to visit his family over the holiday. And your wife, sir, she invited me to your house for Christmas, and she promised me apple pie. And she makes a mighty fine apple pie. I didn't want to miss out on that on account of you selling those apples to buy her some lace, because lace wouldn't be nearly as tasty." There was a moment of pause. Then both men burst out laughing. You spent over $9 so that you would be able to have a slice of pie come Christmas? Ken shrugged. Well, and so's I wouldn't be tempted to spend it on drink. He tossed a guilty look at the parson, in time to see the man's laughter fade into pinched lips. Guess you left $1 too many in your pocket then, didn't you? Hurt rimmed the edges of the words. Ken ducked his head, guilt slicing through him. The parson was a good man who'd offered him nothing but kindness ever since Pa's death had thrown them together. But the man's patience with his drinking was wearing thin these days, and Ken couldn't really blame him. He was a mite impatient with it himself. The sheriff stood and lifted his hat from the chair spindle. He reached out and clapped Ken on one shoulder. Well, I'll be certain you get the largest slice of pie come Christmas, son. The very largest one. The sheriff and the parson were grinning at each other again. Hopefully they would just chalk all this up to the stupidity of youth and not see through to the lie beneath. He didn't want to ruin Christmas for the Callahans. Well, I'd best be going. Sheriff Callahan pushed his hat back onto his head. I need to ride out to the Castaigne place. Seems someone broke into their barn and stole a shovel and a bucket last night. Oh, no. Parson Clay stood. Did they lose anything else? The sheriff shook his head. No. Whoever it was left their cow in her stall, thankfully. He lifted a hand in farewell and stepped through the door. And as Ken watched him go, he realized there was another spill of honey he'd just stepped in. He'd told Mrs. Callahan that he had other plans for Christmas, so she wasn't expecting him. But he supposed he could come up with an excuse to the sheriff later for why he couldn't make it for Christmas after all. He just had to hope that the sheriff didn't say anything to her about it in the meantime. For now, he'd just have to avoid Mrs. Callahan so he wouldn't have to tell more lies. And he'd make a point to let her know he wasn't stealing from her after Christmas when the truth could come out without spoiling anything. He glanced up to find the parson's piercing green gaze drilling into him. He sighed. Time for another lecture. Chapter 9. Charlotte had placed her order for the $7 boots with Mr. Giddens, and for 2 weeks she'd baked pies and delivered them to Dixie's by the back door so she wouldn't have to walk by the front windows of the jailhouse where Reagan might see her and question what she was doing. She never had gotten a satisfactory answer from Reagan on what Ken Davis had said about why he was in their cellar. Reagan had merely said he'd spoken to him and that he wouldn't be prowling around their cellar again. Then he'd made a cryptic comment about Ken and Christmas just before he'd been called away to deal with another instance of things going missing from someone's property. In that case, the Hines had arrived at their store one morning to find that half a jar of penny candy was missing, along with a few candles and some soap. And she'd hardly had a chance to pass more than a few words over dinner with Reagan since. Even then, he'd been so busy chasing about after this petty criminal that he was distracted and a poor conversationalist. She missed him. Hopefully, he would catch whoever was responsible soon and their lives could return to normal. Today, she had awoken with excitement coursing through her. Yesterday, she'd delivered the last pies needed to complete her payment to Mr. Giddens, and Dixie had promised to have her money waiting for her just after the breakfast hour. They'd also made plans to discuss the future of their new pie-making venture. Charlotte had been combing through her recipe books for other types of pies she could bake because she was down to only a few apples at the bottom of the last basket. The lumberjacks would probably appreciate some variety in their desserts anyhow, so it wasn't such a bad thing. Taking up her list and donning her shawl, Charlotte slipped out into the drifting snowflakes and crunched across the squeaking snow toward town. After the frigid walk, the warmth of Dixie's diner was a welcome comfort. Charlotte couldn't wait to wrap her hands around the warmth of a cup of tea. Only patrons occupied the dining room, but that wasn't unusual. She would find Dixie, Susan, and Belle in the kitchen. And after her recent days of practical solitude, she was looking forward to some conversation. "Dixie?" She pushed through the heavy bat-wing doors into the steamy kitchen and froze. Across the room, two men with hats tugged low and bandanas pulled up nearly to their eyes stood holding the three women at gunpoint. Belle's raised hands dripped soap suds. Dixie's hands rested protectively over her baby, and Susan's hands were covered in flour. A batch of bread dough lay partially kneaded on the sideboard. Charlotte took in all this with a blink. And then one of the outlaws swung his gun in Charlotte's direction. She automatically lifted her hands. His eyes were wide, and that was when Charlotte realized these weren't men at all, but youngsters. He motioned with his gun for her to join the other women in the corner. Charlotte scuttled over to do what she was bid. What did they want? And were these the petty criminals that Reagan had been hunting down for the past couple of weeks? You, the taller of the two, pointed at Belle with the gun barrel. Rinse your hands. You're going to fill a basket with food. Charlotte and Dixie exchanged a look. That was a girl's voice. These were just a couple of children. Belle glanced at Dixie. Dixie nodded for her to follow instructions. Belle pumped some water, rinsed her hands, and then led the way to the shelves that composed Dixie's larder and followed the girl's instructions to fill a basket with flour, lard, salt, and bacon. Sugar, the other one said, a boy by the sound of his voice. Don't forget to get some sugar. He moseyed toward the table, all the while keeping half an eye on their little huddle, yet seeming to search the room for something too. Yes, sugar. The girl motioned with her gun. Belle added a packet of sugar to the basket. The boy lifted one of Dixie's pots from its hook above the stove. We should take one of these pots. Would certainly make cooking easier. The girl gave a dip of her chin, and he set the pot on the table. His focus honed in on something on the sideboard, and beside her, Charlotte heard Dixie give a little intake of breath. He reached for a small milk tin and gave it a shake. Metal jingled inside, and he smiled satisfactorily. Charlotte's eyes fell closed. Her boot money. Dixie suddenly stumbled sideways and bent double, gripping the back of a chair with one hand and her belly with the other. She blew out a long breath that was part moan. Charlotte's brow shot up. The baby! Anger surged, sure and certain. These ruffians had sent Dixie into labor. She snatched up the nearby broom and swung it at the boy before she even thought twice. It connected solidly with his shoulder. Ow! He stumbled backward, tripped over his own feet, and sprawled to the floor. His gun tumbled away and slid beneath the wood stove. The red bandana slipped, and just as suspected, he was a peach-cheeked boy, probably no older than 14. His expression revealed shock over Charlotte's attack. She left him lay there and turned her ire on the girl next. Look what you've done! Unfortunately, the girl was too far away to reach with the broom. You've sent my friend into labor. You both ought to be ashamed of yourselves. She chucked the broom aside. Just take whatever you intend to take and be gone. The girl snapped her fingers at the boy. Get up. Leave the money. We ain't here to steal, only to take what we need to survive. The boy rose with a grumble and readjusted his bandana. I weren't going to take it all. Just $1 or $2 so's we could buy some things proper instead of stealing everything. Well, we ain't taking it. Get your gun. He glanced toward the stove. Can't. Stove's too hot. Dixie blew out another groan. Charlotte motioned toward the broom. Use that. She couldn't believe she was helping the kid retrieve his gun, but at this point she just wanted them gone so they could find Doc and get Dixie upstairs. She rubbed Dixie's back and bent to peer into her face. You doing okay? Dixie only glowered at her, and Charlotte realized she probably deserved that. Though the boy put the tin of money on the table, he kept glancing toward it, attention only half on the job of sweeping his gun from beneath the stove. Charlotte didn't care at this point. She just wanted them to leave so she could help Dixie and find Doc. The girl stepped away from the shelves with her knapsack so full that she could barely sling it over one shoulder. We got what we came for. Come on. Keeping the room covered by her pistol, she poked her head out the door and checked the street. All clear. Let's go. The boy gave one last glance at the tin of money, snatched it up, and followed the girl out the door. Charlotte's heart sank. All her hard-earned money. But she couldn't bring herself to care about it right now. She was simply thankful that they were gone.
Come on, Dix. Let's get you upstairs. Belle, find Flynn.
Dixie released a long breath, hand on her belly as she bent double. Charlotte rubbed her back, feeling a little bit terrified. She wished Mother hadn't been so stingy with her information about childbirth. Every time Charlotte had asked her about it, she had brushed a hand through the air and exclaimed, "Oh, it will all be clear enough when the time comes, dear." What if Dixie was too far gone to be able to move? If she had to deliver this child right here in the kitchen, she had no idea what to do. But Dixie suddenly stood and smiled wanly. "All right, I think I can move now." Charlotte realized Belle was still frozen in place.
Belle?
Eyes wide, Belle nodded.
Yes, on my way.
She lifted her skirts and spun toward the dining room door, then back to the outside door, and then froze again.
Where should I start my search?
Dixie waved a hand toward McGinty's. "I believe he's next door. Treating one of Ewan's tenants, if he hasn't been called elsewhere. Start there." Belle scurried out to the street, slamming the door behind her. Charlotte eyed Dixie.
Ready?
"Yes. I think I can make it upstairs now." Susan was washing her hands at the sink. "I'll be up in just a few minutes with warm water." Charlotte gave her a nod.
Come on.
She nudged Dixie toward the dining room door. They were halfway up the stairs when Dixie paused, gripped the handrail, bent forward, and loosed a long breath. Charlotte hoped she couldn't feel her hand trembling as she rubbed her back again.
What do you need me to do?
"Just give me a moment," Dixie panted. Charlotte didn't want to give her a moment. She wanted to get her upstairs and into her bed and turn her over to Rose. If delivering a baby in the kitchen was bad, delivering one on the stairs was infinitely worse. Slowly, Dixie unclenched her hand from the rail and straightened. Charlotte literally bit her tongue so she wouldn't rush her on her way. At that moment, the main doors of the boarding house burst open and Doc rushed into the entry. "Oh, thank you, Lord." Charlotte released a sigh of relief. "Dixie!" Doc was grinning from ear to ear. "You doing all right, darling?" Doctor bag in one hand, he rushed up the stairs. Dixie ignored him. It seemed like it was taking all her concentration to climb the stairs. Doc thrust his bag into Charlotte's hands. He scooped his wife into his arms. "How long has she been in labor?"
She was supposed to know that? We were in the kitchen and these kids broke in and...
What? Charlotte gave up on trying to explain that right now. He wouldn't be able to do anything about it anyhow.
She went into labor in the kitchen about 20 minutes ago.
Dixie shook her head.
5 o'clock this morning.
5? Doc peered into Dixie's face. "You knew you were in labor and you let me go out on a call?" She gave a wave of her hand. "Just get me to my bed, Flynn, before another contraction comes." "How far apart are your contractions? You been counting like I told you to?" Dixie glowered at him. "I've had a few other things going on, Flynn." He glanced back at Charlotte as he hefted Dixie past the last step to the landing. "Right. Kids broke in, you said?"
"They didn't harm us. Just wanted food, I think."
And her money. Now that Flynn was here to take care of Dixie, Charlotte felt the full impact of what she'd lost. Reagan's Christmas present. Sure, she can bake and sell more pies, but the money wouldn't come in soon enough for her to have the boots under the tree on Christmas morning. Disappointment lodged in her throat. Now, what was she going to give Reagan? Charlotte realized she still stood halfway down the stairs with Doc's bag in her hand. She rushed to catch up to Flynn and Dixie.
"Flynn, is there anything you need me to do? Susan's heating water in the kitchen."
He shook his head. "Thanks for bringing her this far. I'll take it from here." He bent and somehow managed to turn the door handle while still holding Dixie. Unaccountably, disappointment surged through Charlotte. Only a moment ago she'd been terrified that she might have to deliver this baby. Now she was disappointed to be dismissed.
"All right, I'd better go let Reagan know about the kid."
The door clicked shut in her face. Shoulders slumping, she set his doctor bag by the door and turned for the lobby. Chapter 10. Ken leaned against the corner of Dixie's boarding house, looking down toward McGinty's. He brushed a hand over the bills in his pocket and swallowed. He'd spent the past few weeks fishing long hours and then selling the meat in the logging camps come evenings. He'd been doing pretty good at not spending the money on liquor, keeping himself busy. But then today, he'd decided to take a day to rest, and a couple hours ago that familiar, powerful thirst had come on him. If he hadn't been in town when the wagon with Ewan's new supplies had arrived, he might have been okay. But from the moment he'd seen that crate of rum being hauled inside, he hadn't been able to think of anything else. His gaze moved involuntarily to the church across the street and up on the hill. He owed a lot to Parson Clay. PC would be mighty disappointed if he had to come haul him out of Ewan's again, and Kin had no doubt that if he stepped through the alehouse doors, PC would come looking for him later. But he returned his focus to Ewan's. He could hear the music pumping from the old, mostly out-of-tune piano now. He loosed a breath, pushed away from the wall, and started toward the alehouse. Just then, the front door of Dixie's Boardinghouse opened, and Charlotte Callahan stepped out into his path. Whoa! Only then did Kin realize how quickly he'd been moving. He stepped back. Sorry about that. He paused. You okay? Mrs. Callahan quickly dashed at her cheeks.
Kin, hi. No.
What happened?
Well, Dixie went into labor. That's a good thing.
Kin eyed her damp cheeks warily. Is something wrong with her? She swiped at the moisture again with a little laugh.
Oh, no. I think she'll be fine. Doc is with her.
She swirled emotion at her evidence of tears.
This is because...
Oh, no. Was she going to start crying again? He looked around, hoping to see someone he could hand the distraught woman off to, but it was only the two of them on the street. Her face crumpled.
A couple of kids broke into Dixie's and stole some things, including the money I've been saving to buy Reagan's boots.
Kin's focus sharpened on her. I'm sorry. His jaw clamped in irritation. The money he'd spent to save those apples had apparently been wasted. So you aren't going to be able to get the sheriff the boots? She shook her head.
Wasn't meant to be, I guess. I need to let Reagan know about the robbery. Then I'll stop by and let Bill know I can't buy the boots just yet after all.
Kin remained where he was as he watched her walk past McGinty's and on into the jailhouse. He rubbed a hand over the bills in his shirt pocket once more, glanced at the livery, looked back at the church. He sighed. It only took him half a minute to find Bill Giddens. He was seated on the workbench in his tack room. The old man leaned over a saddle he was hand-tooling, face so close to his work it was a wonder he could see anything. Kin cleared his throat. Bill sat up with a start, brows raising. Obviously his ears worked just about as good as his eyes these days, because he ought to have heard Kin's boots crunching over the sandy floor.
Kin Davis, land, you grown boy. What can I do you for?
Kin tossed a glance over his shoulder. He needed to hurry if he was going to pull this off without getting caught. He tugged the bills from his pocket. Listen, Mrs. Callahan is going to be here in just a moment.
Eh? Speak up, kid.
Kin raised his voice. Mrs. Callahan. She's going to come tell you she can't buy the boots, but... He held up the money. You tell her someone covered it. Mr. Giddens gave him an assessing look.
Where'd you get that kind of money?
I worked for it. Kin pressed the bills into the old man's hands. And keep my name out of it, would you? Just tell her it was someone who appreciates all she's done for this town. He hurried out the back slider of the barn so that if Mrs. Callahan was already headed this way, she wouldn't see him coming out. And as he rushed toward the parsonage, he tried his best not to think about the sweet taste of the rum he was missing out on. Charlotte dragged her feet toward the jailhouse, doing her best to get her sadness in check, but it was no use. By the time she arrived, tears streamed down her face. The moment she stepped into the room, Reagan lurched from his chair and hurried toward her. What's wrong? He took her by the shoulders and bent to peer into her face. You've been crying. What's the matter, Charlie? Charlotte couldn't bring herself to look him in the eye. Never had a Christmas gone by where she hadn't given those she loved a gift. And yet here she was, only in her second Christmas of their marriage, and she had failed to get her husband a gift. Now, not only would she not have nice hand-tooled boots to give him, but now she didn't even have her original $2 and change to buy him something mediocre from Jerry Hines Mercantile. Perhaps she should suggest to Priscilla that she get her husband a correctly spelled store sign for Christmas, she thought grumpily. Reagan's hands soothed up and down her arms. "You're scaring me, Charlie. Are you hurt?" Oh, what was the use in hiding anything from him now? He wasn't going to get a present, and it would be better if he learned that now instead of after anticipating it for several weeks and then waking up on Christmas and finding no present, right? She sank against the comfort of his chest, thankful that he had no prisoners in the cells at the moment, so they were alone in the privacy of his office.
Oh, Reagan, I'm so sorry.
Reagan's arms were strong and warm around her back. He pressed his cheek to the top of her head. One hand rubbed small circles into the muscles along her spine. "What are you sorry about?" Charlotte sniffed, and a hiccup caught in her throat.
"I've failed to get you a Christmas present. At least not one that will be under the tree on Christmas."
"Charlotte, I don't need—"
"Not that I haven't tried, mind you. I ordered a pair of boots for you from Bill Giddens, but I only had a couple dollars saved up, and they were more expensive than that."
For a moment, her throat closed off, and she couldn't get any more words out. "It's really—"
"But I went to Dixie's, and Ken Davis came by. He said I make really good apple pie."
"Yes, he told me the same." She heard a smile in Reagan's voice, even as his hand kept rubbing soothing circles. Why was he finding humor in her confession of failure? The realization made her cry all the harder.
"Anyhow, I've been working for weeks, baking apple pies and selling them at Dixie's."
She felt him stiffen and hurried on before he could interrupt. Maybe if she could just explain all that had happened, he would understand.
"And I was supposed to go and pay for them today. The boots, not the pies. But I was just at Dixie's to pick up the money, and these two children were there, and they stole all the money."
She forced herself to lean back and look into his face. He at least deserved that when he heard the bad news. And she ought to see the expression on his face as penance for her failure. He frowned. "Two children stole your money from Dixie's just now?" She felt a fat tear drip off her chin and slide down her neck.
"Yes, but they're long gone by now."
She flapped a hand.
"They sent Dixie into labor, and I thought I was going to have to deliver the baby, and Dixie was having a hard time making it up the stairs, so then I thought I might have to deliver the baby on the stairs."
Reagan looked appropriately appalled. She nodded.
"But Doc is with her now."
"I'll wait a bit to go ask my questions then."
"Probably best. But there was a boy and a girl. They wore bandanas, but I could tell. The boy was maybe 14. I saw his face when I hit him with the broom, and his gun fell under the stove."
Reagan's eyes widened. "They had guns? Wait, you hit him with a broom?"
"He sent Dixie into labor."
Charlotte brushed away his questions about the kids.
"Anyhow, now I don't have money to pay for your present."
A sob tightened her chest, and another hiccup shook her. Reagan cupped her face and swiped away her tears with his thumbs. His eyes twinkled as he bent down and pressed a soft kiss against her lips. She frowned.
"Why are you smiling and kissing me when I've just confessed that I failed to get you a present?"
He stroked her cheeks again. "Because you are amazing." Her face contorted. Had the man not heard a word she said?
"But I'm not. I just told you."
Reagan laid a finger over her lips. "Charlie, I didn't marry you for the awesome Christmas presents I would get. Giving gifts at Christmas is about the spirit of sacrifice. And I can tell by how upset this has made you that you've had that spirit in spades. You tried to get me a pair of boots, right?" She nodded.
"I tried really hard. I even asked Zoe to get a tracing of your feet, so I would know what size to order." She couldn't help but smile at him through her tears. He tossed back his head on a laugh and then rubbed his nose against hers.
"You are a genius, and I love you more for wanting to give me a present than for any present you could or will ever give me."
She studied his face. His blue eyes, filled with merriment, looked back at her frankly. "So, you're really not upset?" Reagan brushed another kiss against her lips.
"I'm really not upset. It's all going to be fine."
She released a long sigh. She hadn't realized until just now how worried she was over how he would feel. "Well, I need to go tell Bill that I can't pay for the boots right away. But I want you to know I'll keep baking and selling desserts until I get them paid for. They just won't be under the tree at Christmas." Reagan stepped back and glanced down at his feet. He lifted first one split-out boot and then the other, and then he gave her a wink.
"I can't see why you thought that was such a good present anyhow. This pair's so comfortable. Nice and airy, too."
Suddenly feeling lighter than a feather, she laughed and gave him a playful smack. "Your mother warned me that I might have a hard time prying them off your feet, but be assured, Sheriff, those boots will disappear when the new ones arrive."
He gave a dramatic sigh and rolled his eyes. "Fine, if they must."
Charlotte started for the door, but then paused and turned to face him. "Thank you for not letting Christmas be ruined because of this." He tilted her a look.
"How could Christmas be ruined when we have each other?"
Charlotte gave in to the temptation for one more kiss. She crossed the room and looped her arms around his neck, offering him a lingering one. "I really am spoiled to have found a man like you." He grinned and rocked her from side to side.
"Christmas will be amazing, boots or no boots. But, Charlie?"
"Yes?"
"I think we should invite Ken Davis to the house. A slice of your pie is probably just the thing to make his Christmas."
"Oh, I asked him already, and he said he has other plans."
Reagan smiled mysteriously. "Go talk to Bill. And after that, I think you should ask Ken again. I have a feeling he'll say yes this time. Tell him I said he deserves some pie."
Charlotte shrugged and headed for the door. "Okay, I'll try. Oh, and Reagan?"
"Yeah?"
"Go easy on those kids when you find them, would you? I got the feeling they're just trying to survive."
Reagan frowned. "Trying to survive or not doesn't make it right for them to be stealing stuff around town."
Charlotte opened the door. "I know, but it is Christmas."
Reagan sighed. "I'll keep your wishes in mind."
She nodded. "That's all I can ask." A few minutes later, Charlotte stepped out of the livery, feeling like a child on Christmas morning about to explode with excitement. She paused in the street. She propped her hands on her hips, despite the fact that her finishing school teacher, Miss Giddon, would chastise her for such an unladylike gesture. A glance both up and down revealed no one in sight. Who would have known about her money being stolen and had time to get to the livery? She felt a bit as though she'd been tied to the end of a whip all day. One moment excited about picking up her money, the next having it stolen, worrying about Dixie, fearing she'd have to deliver the baby, and then being dismissed by Flynn, confessing to Reagan that she wouldn't be able to give him the boots, and now suddenly finding out that someone else had paid for them and she would be able to have them under the tree after all. Who could have done it? Her gaze snagged on the boarding house. Susan. It had to have been Susan Castaigne. Or Belle? She shook her head. No, Belle gave all her money to her mother. But maybe it was something they had decided on together? She strode purposefully and pushed through the boarding house kitchen door. Susan must already have taken the pot of warm water upstairs because she was once more at the table, swiftly shaping loaves out of the dough she'd kneaded earlier. How are things upstairs? Doc seemed to think things were progressing as they should. Susan shrugged a shoulder. Charlotte barged ahead with the purpose of her return. Susan, you are an angel, and I'll pay you back. Honest, I will. Susan looked up, a blank look on her face. Charlotte grinned at her. You may look at me with that innocent face all you want, dear friend, but I know it had to be you. Susan's mouth opened and closed a few times.
Her forehead scrunched into a questioning slump. "Whatever you think it is I've done, I assure you that I haven't left the boarding house since you and I stood right here a few minutes ago. I heated the water and only came down from upstairs just a couple minutes ago." She gestured to the bread. "I've been working on these loaves since then." Charlotte folded her arms and tilted her head, certain the woman had to be pulling her leg.
"So you didn't just go to the livery and pay Bill Giddens so I could give Reagan boots on Christmas morning?"
Susan's brows shot up.
"Someone did that? That's wonderful."
Charlotte plunked her hands on her hips.
"It really wasn't you?"
A smile tugged at Susan's lips even as she shook her head. She brushed a lock of her autumn red hair away from her face.
"It really wasn't me."
Charlotte stepped to the door and scanned the street once more.
"Well, if I believed in Santa Claus, I'd say he just swept down from the sky in his sleigh."
Susan chuckled. "Not knowing is killing you, isn't it?"
"It really is."
Across the street from Dixie's and up the hill, Ken Davis was just disappearing into the parsonage. Charlotte gasped. No. She thought back. Why, it had to be. There was no other explanation. Tugging her coat tighter about her, she folded her arms and hurried up the hill. It only took a moment after her knock for him to answer the door. He looked surprised to see her. "Mrs. Callahan. Hi." He stepped back. "The parson's not here right now, but do you need something?" She didn't enter. Instead, she searched his face. After her quick accusation of Susan that had turned out to be inaccurate, she was a little more hesitant this time.
"Did you pay for Reagan's boots just now?"
He rubbed the back of his head. Confusion was written all over his face. "You just told me you weren't going to be able to afford them." She nodded.
"Someone paid for them without my knowledge. It wasn't you?"
His brow furrowed and he shrugged one shoulder. "Why would you think it was me?" She searched his face. Was he pulling one over on her?
"Not many people knew of my predicament."
It had to be him, didn't it?
"I simply wanted to say thank you from the bottom of my heart."
Ken frowned. "Mrs. Callahan, surely Mr. Giddens didn't tell you it was me?"
"He didn't. Not a peep. He outright refused to tell me who it was."
Ken peered at her. "I think you need to keep after Mr. Giddens. He'll likely tell you who it was eventually, maybe after Christmas. Whoever helped you likely cares about you and the sheriff a good deal and only wanted to spur on your Christmas cheer." Charlotte searched his face. Surely he would have confessed if he were the one who'd done it. Her shoulders drooped a little. She turned to scrutinize the houses of the town. Who else could it have been? Surely not Mr. Giddens himself. She stomped one booted foot.
"Oh, it's going to plague me with curiosity until I figure out who it was."
Ken smiled. "Perhaps you should simply accept the gift in the spirit I'm sure it was meant?" Charlotte shook her head.
"I will accept it for now. But mark my words, I will figure it out and repay whoever it was, and that's certain."
She started back down the hill, but then remembered and turned back.
"Oh, and Reagan says that I should insist you come to our house for Christmas. He seemed to think you'd like some apple pie."
Ken's eyes widened a little. "Yes, ma'am. I think I can arrange that."
"Excellent. We'll see you then."
Despite being foiled at finding out who her benefactor might have been, she felt lighter than air as she skipped down the hill. Sheriff Reagan of Wyldhaven would get his Christmas boots after all. This has been an unabridged production of Sheriff Reagan's Christmas Boots by Lynnette Bonner. Copyright 2019 by Lynnette Bonner. Read by Amy Lilly. Directed and engineered by Adam Hassel at the Oasis Audio Studios. If you've enjoyed this audio production, please look for Doc Griffin's Christmas Sleigh, Story 6 in the Wyldhaven series. It can be found on Amazon, iTunes, and Audible.